Welcome everybody. My name is Arash Davari. I'm a visiting fellow at the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. And I'm very excited today to convene a conversation with two scholars who I respect dearly, Elleni Centime Zeleke and Eskandar Sadeghi-Boroujerdi. The conversation today is called Writing Revolutions, History and Theory Between Ethiopia and Iran. Both of these scholars, both of our guests today, have published books recently. Eskandar's book is called Revolution and Its Discontents, Political Thought and Reform in Iran. It was released in 2019 on Cambridge University Press. Centime's book is Ethiopia in Theory, Revolution and Knowledge Production, 1964 to 2016. It was released on Brill and will be released on paperback by Haymarket Press in 2020. Now, these books have been brought together today by me. And in a sense, you might be wondering why we're bringing these two books together. And so I'd like to take a moment to very briefly talk about the conversation itself, why the conversation's happening, how it'll happen, and then pass the microphone over to our guests. So I think it goes without saying that there are some important and substantial differences between the two stories that are being told in these books. Ethiopia isn't Iran, and Iran isn't Ethiopia. I'm interested over the course of the next hour or so in kind of hashing out the differences between the two cases. Nevertheless, there are some striking similarities that I think create the basis or the foundations for a conversation, a shared conversation. And so I wanted to very briefly point out some of those similarities to give our audience, our listeners, a sense of why we're having this conversation in the first place. So just some basic kinds of brushstrokes. Both states, Ethiopia and Iran, were ruled by modernizing monarchs when revolutions occurred in the 1970s. Both had significant activist student populations who were organizing abroad. Both revolutionary movements, to some degree, were concerned with questions of land reforms that they deemed had not served their purpose. Both cases experienced moments of, both states, experienced moments of direct colonization at certain points, but generally encountered colonial rule in a kind of semi-fashion. And that experience, to some degree or another, shaped their pursuit of self-determination. And both states, it's important to note, have significant ethnic nationality populations who played an important role in revolutionary and post-revolutionary processes. I'm thinking, of course, of Eritreans in Ethiopia and the Kurds in Iran. And so, as I was reading your books, it struck me that despite the fact that you've never met each other before, this is the first time that you're meeting each other here in this conversation, that it almost felt as if perhaps in the writing of the books, in the process of writing the books, you had been engaged in a kind of indirect conversation with one another. And I think that's a testament to how deeply you both engaged your archives. It's no surprise, it's not something that is unknown. People know that Ethiopian and Iranian student activists were in communication with one another over the course of the 1970s. There are these significant overlaps that I've noted. So it almost makes sense that in 2019, 2020, books come out where scholars have engaged these archives, and there's almost these parallel qualities to the stories they tell, despite the fact that they had never had a conversation with one another. So I'm very excited about this opportunity to kind of draw that out. And to see where we go over the course of this session, which brings me to how the session will proceed. So this is not a traditional book talk. I'd like to ask each of you to speak very briefly about what you think your book is about at this point in time. And my framing of the point of departure in that way is deliberate, because both of these books talk about how the past lives in the present. And both of these books, to some degree, are talking about extraordinary moments where things that we are accustomed to suddenly and dramatically change. And here we are in 2020, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of uprisings taking place in the United States, in the wake of yet another police murder, in the midst of a general kind of sense of upheaval. And it might not be immediately clear why or how books that were written in a previous moment might still speak to our contemporary moment. And I'm not necessarily interested in us answering that question, but rather searching in the dark together for the next hour, hour and a half or so. And so I'd really like for the conversation to be collaborative, to be a conversation in a constructive, searching kind of spirit, without pretending that we're going to resolve contradictions, but rather, if I may borrow from Centime, to kind of go back into the contradictions of the past and open them up again in order to see where we might go in the future. So I'll leave it at that. And I'd like to first invite Centime to speak very briefly about what you think your book is about. And then we'll switch over to Eskandar. And then I'll jump in loosely and try to draw connections between what you've each said and ask some questions about points of convergence in your books.
I just want to say one thing before I answer the question. You've been referring to me as Centime. I think a lot of people know me as Elleni. So I tend to go by my middle name, which is Centime, just for you know, the audience out there, in case they get confused. Elleni and Centime are the same person. So what is my book about? I mean, I think at a very sort of superficial level, the book is about the Ethiopian student movement of the 1960s and 1970s, and the ways in which that student movement was engaged with social theory that they encountered in the university setting. In Addis Ababa University, which was then known as Haile Selassie, the first university, but also many of these students were being educated in Beirut, they were being educated in New York, they were at Brandeis, a bunch of folks were at Brandeis, and so they were all encountering social theory in these different contexts. And they started to ask themselves, what is the relevance of this social theory to the Ethiopian context? And they were particularly interested in using Marxism to think through questions that were particular to the Ethiopian context, or I would say to the context of the Horn of Africa more generally. So I think on one level, that's what the book is about. And it's about the kinds of questions that they posed and the kinds of answers that they came up with, and how those answers, in some senses, shaped the revolution of 1974 in Ethiopia, but also the ways in which policy has been articulated since 1974 in Ethiopia. So you can read the book simply as a kind of history. But at a deeper level, I think the book is asking how these students produced knowledge, and how did they actually think about what social theory was for them. How did they actually think about Marxism, and what kind of method of appropriation did they develop to translate Marxism to the Ethiopian context, right? You know, they are not necessarily, a lot of people refer to the students as elites. I don't really see them as elites. They're being pulled from very different parts of the country as Ethiopia develops a policy around creating an educated class of people for a kind of modernizing bureaucracy, right? So there's this initiative to train younger folks in like a secular Western tradition. And so they are like, their whole social milieu is changing. They're confronting social theory. They're like, okay, how do we make sense of our changing social situation through social theory and Marxism in particular? And they start to think of themselves as scientists in many ways, right? And they're scientists very much opposed to the tradition of knowledge production that would have existed in Ethiopia through the church or through the mosque and that kind of thing, right? So how do they understand the social sciences? And I posit in my book that the student movement can be seen as one of the moments in Ethiopia where the social sciences really becomes important in a very different sort of way. And so what is the social sciences in Ethiopia? So that's an interesting question. And I think it's a question that African studies has been asking for the past 100 years as well, right? How do we do social sciences in Africa? So the book, on another level, so there's multiple levels happening in the book. So on another level, the question that the book asks is, what does it mean to practice the social sciences in Africa? And I try to propose that we can't really answer that question simply by going back to the indigenous, because what is the indigenous? The indigenous is constantly changing and shifting according to new political economies and so on. So it's not a question of going back to the indigenous, but really asking about the sort of political context through which the social sciences travels to Ethiopia and the ways in which people produce knowledge through this new framework, right? And so I think lastly, the book is an attempt to think about what critical theory is in Ethiopia and what does it mean for me today am I a social scientist? I'm like somewhere between political theory, the humanities, and the social sciences. But certainly I'm asking the question of what does it mean for me to write this story about the Ethiopian student movement as somebody practicing the social sciences within a Western institution, and how do I write that story? What is the method that I use that both does justice to those students, but also moves beyond, an idea of myself simply as a scientist. So I think that's all the different levels in which the book is operating. Mm-hmm. I'll end there.
Thank you, Eskandar.
Yeah, so I can see what you're saying about a lot of the resonances and similarities and sort of shared, methodological questions as well. But yeah, just very broadly, because I know you've sort of got several questions in tow, so I don't want to obviously preempt that. But yeah, just very broadly, it's sort of like an intellectual sort of history of the reform movement in Iran, post-revolutionary reform movement, which really began, you could say, in the late 1980s with sort of the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, the end of the Iran-Iraq War, but obviously really comes to public attention in 1997 with the election of Mohammad Khatami. But yeah, the core of the book is really just, it goes back quite far into sort of the 50s, but the heart of the book is really looking at this period from the late 1980s, the end of the Cold War, or maybe a little bit earlier, I guess, the beginning of the 1980s, through to and obviously following the end of the Cold War, through to about 2005 or so. And what I really try to do is provide a sort of look at kind of the way in which, it's almost like the conditions of intellectual production, the way in which reformist discourse really came to be and how it was produced and reproduced. So what I look at is sort of the material basis of sort of reformist discourse, and particularly sort of look at these sort of networks of think tanks which pop up, reading groups, editorial boards, and all manner of things, and how these in a sense traverse both the state and the political class. And this is sort of how this discourse of reform and reformism basically emerges, and in many ways becomes hegemonic. Which again, we can talk a little bit more subsequently. But what I'm also focusing on is how basically a post-revolutionary elite, how their basically vantage point on sort of the revolutionary state changes as their relationship to that state and vantage point on that state changes. So part of that story, part of the story I tell is sort of how this faction, which I spend a lot of time on, to so-called sort of Islamic left, which we can discuss more later, how basically as they're in essence pushed out of power in the early 1990s, there is in a sense this shift and a shift of perspective on the state, and then we see a sort of an accompanying shift in their ideological orientation. So we see a sort of a shift from sort of a left populism, obviously also Islamist in many of its sort of key preoccupations and sort of objectives, but nevertheless identifiably to the left for various reasons. Suddenly moves to embrace basically a form of Cold War liberalism. And obviously I'm simplifying because I just want to sort of give you an overview, but that's sort of in a sense, it's trying to tell that story and the effects of that on political practice and the way in which actually political change, political agency and transformation come to be understood by a significant swath of the political class.
So both of you claim in your books that you're not doing histories as such, that your books can be read as histories, but you're not necessarily doing comprehensive histories as such. And yet both of you are doing a kind of historical analysis. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you're doing with history in your books. How are you historicizing?
Do you want to go first, Eskandar?
Whichever, yeah, I can, if you want, sure. So, I mean, I say that because obviously I'm not doing, as you're aware, like with most nationalist historiographies, it's about sort of, you know, this event happened and this event happened, this administration, this prime minister, this sort of, particularly when you're doing elite politics, that's usually the elite sort of political history, that's usually the case. I was actually more interested in a problem, which was sort of how did revolution cease to be, in essence, intelligible for those who had participated in that revolution. So it's also like it's an intellectual history, but it's also, I mean, it's, in many ways, it's a partially, at least, a more conventional sort of ideological critique. I mean, I'm trying to sort of historicize reform, understand how this sort of discourse of reform in Iran emerged. So as opposed to kind of falling, I mean, as you're aware, like a lot of histories of Iran fall into this sort of Whiggish pattern of seeing, you know, this gradual unfolding towards something like a liberal democratic parliamentarian order. And we have sort of, you know, the constitutional revolution, and we have Mossadegh, and we have, you know, etc. And the sort of the Islamic revolution seen as a disruption, a problematic one. And obviously there's different ways in which that's rationalized, and obviously then the reform movement is seen as another one, etc. So I wanted to get away from that and actually try and understand how reform itself is, you know, deeply embedded in structures and relations of power. So that's why I historicize it and put it very much in relation to the sort of the original sort of critiques of the left and of Marxism, which begin obviously earlier on, but really come to the fore as a state project with the Cultural Revolution in Iran. And that's also why I'm interested in sort of not just looking at sort of the reformist intelligentsia, but seeing how the reformist intelligentsia is absolutely intertwined. And this is why it's a genealogical critique. In that sense, its history is genealogical, looking at how the intelligentsia and this political class are very much intertwined, intersect. And that's obviously very significant for how they actually understand power themselves. And yeah, part of this is also just a project, I guess, of demystifying reform and how at least it's been represented by its proponents in Iran, and almost like a symptomological reading insofar as we're sort of looking at where the occlusions are, what's been omitted, in a sense, how does this discourse end up really reproducing often dominant relations of power in certain respects. And also not just that, I mean, there's also sort of the question, Bourdieuian sort of question of, the reproduction of power and how sort of reformist discourse sort of sought to, through sort of symbolic violence, or claims certain political lexicon, and in a sense fix that as the only legitimate way in which we can understand and think about reform and change and historical change in Iran. So in a sense, it was trying to disrupt that quite a bit. And obviously, yeah, I mean, readers, you can tell me whether it was relatively successful or not, but in any event, that was part of the impetus behind it, the sort of genealogical ideological critique.
Right. Why am I not doing history? Let's see. I think I also started my book with an event. And that event was actually the 2005 elections in Ethiopia, which were supposed to be this kind of, it's supposed to mark a moment of the entrenchment of a liberal democratic regime in Ethiopia. And it was the first time where there was sort of fair and free elections and all of that language that was being used, except that when the result came out, there was a lot of contestation of what the results were. And the ruling regime at that time basically said that they had won the elections and that the opposition hadn't. There was a whole sort of rhetoric that was generated about, authoritarianism and democracy and so on. And my sense was that none of the things that were being written about the 2005 elections were actually getting at the kind of conundrums that were facing the various players within that election. And I think, within African studies, again, you have these polarities of authoritarianism versus liberal democracy, or kind of like, irrationality versus, reasonable behaviors and so on. And I was just like, that none of that isn't like, the language of political science, mainstream political science. I was like, none of that is actually explaining what's going on here. And the other thing that I think was other event that was significant for me was the there was a lot of urban protests between 2014 and 2016 in Ethiopia. And that was around land privatization and the ways in which the peri-urban areas of Addis Ababa were being incorporated into a kind of commercialized idea of what land should be. And those protests were very ethnicized, so they were understood to be led by the Oromo people of Ethiopia, who are traditionally seen as, I guess, outside of the ambit of Abyssinia. So Ethiopia is like associated with the Abyssinian kings and queens, a kind of Christian myth. There's a Christian myth about Ethiopia, and the Oromos are seen as outside of that. So there was a whole critique of the nation state as Christian, as Abyssinian, and these Oromos were challenging all of that. And so the question of land, the question of the commodification of land and privatization, and what kinds of policies one would need in order to address those questions were never on the table when people were talking about the 2005 elections or really the 2016 protests. Again, the language of authoritarianism was the language that was being used, and the need to just sort of liberalize the political sphere. So I guess the thing that I was interested in doing then was to go back into the archives and to think, well, who else was talking about these questions about land and commodification before? What happened to those questions? Where are those debates today in Ethiopia? Why are we not actually paying attention to those debates? Because you would think that there was no political thought in Ethiopia, actually. If you just read like the news media or something, it's just like these authoritarian ogres, right? So I was like, no, there's an entire set of debates about the land question. So my immediate interest in going back to the student movement was actually to understand where these ideas had come from and why they had disappeared in many ways from the discourse. And if it was possible to sort of rethink present questions, given that there has been this debate that has happened in the past, right? I mean, the other thing that was really interesting for me, though, is that once I started looking at the players in 2005, in particular, I was like, yo, it's the same people that have been having these conversations, right? Which was a bit shocking to me, right? And so I really started to understand that the student movement had been shaping the parameters of the debate, even though people had shifted in their politics over, over the decades, that the student movement still was very much in charge of how debates were unfolding politically in Ethiopia. So again, going back was a way to rethink the present. But I wasn't interested in truth as such, this is the truth of the event, A, B, C, D, E. I started to think about the present as, I use the language of haunting all the time in my book, and the present is being haunted by the past, and that these questions that had been raised by the student movement continued to be the questions that were actually shaping political life in Ethiopia today. So rather than establishing truth, I wanted to establish the ways in which the present was haunted by the past. And I don't think necessarily that a kind of positivist rendering of truth gets at the ways in which the past is haunted.
Okay, so now
present haunted, yeah.
we're starting to get, I think, at some of the meat of the matter, and I'd like to pursue this a little bit more because both books have a critique of positivism.
Right.
And both books, in effect, are doing to some degree what Eskandar mentioned as an ideology critique of liberalism as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so let me ask the question in this way. If your book, Centime, is not interested in truth, then how do you avoid falling into easy relativism, which is a phrase you use at the end of your introduction, right? What are you doing if you're not interested in the truth?
Oh my, big questions, big questions. Gosh. So, I mean, I actually structure the book by saying that I am this fellow named Jonas. Jonas is a person from the Ethiopian diaspora. He's written about in a book of literature by Dinal Mengistu, who wrote a book called How to Read the Air. And How to Read the Air is about the child of Ethiopian immigrants in the US. And Jonas is very confused about how to live his life. And he keeps on telling stories in order to, he's like, I'm a Black man in America, people have certain expectations of me. And he tells stories in order to produce kind of an effect on the audience, right? And he keeps on telling these stories, and people are wowed, and they're like, amazing, and oh, you've suffered so much, or your family has, it has a dramatic story, and all of these things. And every time he tells the story and has this sort of effect on people, something happens to him, and the violence that he's inherited from the political context in which he comes in sort of is constantly exploding in this uncanny way. In his body, in his relationships, he's unable to sustain relationships. He's unable to sort of connect with people. So he has these moments of connection through this like narrative effect, but in fact, violence is constantly undermining the way he can operate in the world, right? And he's constantly falling apart. And so one of the things that Jonas does is he keeps on he takes these journeys that he thinks his parents took. Some of them might be real journeys, some of them might be made up journeys, but he constantly feels the need to go back and rethink the journeys of his parents. And that becomes like, I guess, a form of healing for him. And it also becomes a way of truth making. Like there's a creativity involved in establishing the truth. There is definitely an object out there, the Ethiopian revolution, there's violence there, but he has to construct the story for himself and learn how to live with the effects of the story in many ways, right? So that's what he does. And I say that that's what I'm doing in my book in many ways, right? I'm like constantly reconstructing, going back and forth between the past and the present to reconstruct sort of how we got there. Not to say that this is exactly the truth, but as a way to live with a kind of uncanny violence that is constantly erupting, I guess at a personal level, but within the country as well, right? So I'm not giving up on a notion of sort of collective truth, but I think truth is something that we make together rather than something that's just found in a book somewhere or an archive somewhere. Aha, here we have it, right?
You said, what you just said brings to mind the ways that your book kind of really masterfully moves between what you're doing and what the people you're talking about are doing. Mm-hmm. So you just identified how you're attempting to be creative yourself.
Right.
In numerous times throughout the book, you talk about how the people you're talking about are creative.
Yeah, and there's a generosity there, right? Like if I'm sort of trying to create this narrative, less for an effect because I'm not constructing a useful history. Like, I'm really against that notion of useful history. In fact, I'm really interested much more in like these uncanny effects of the past on the present. And there's a generosity in, if I see the past as having multiple sort of potentialities, I also want to give that to the people I'm studying as well. There wasn't just one thing that they were doing, right? So in being generous to them, I'm also being generous to myself.
I'm fascinated by that register though, because at one and the same time, it's to recognize creativity and to say that these ideas are not a derivative discourse, they're creative.
Right.
And also to not just then say because they were creative, they're good. You're still engaging in critique.
Yeah.
And I think, Eskandar, you're doing a similar thing as well. At one and the same time, if I'm reading you correctly, you're saying, look, here are these ideological or political theory kind of formations that are emerging in the Iranian context. And we need to recognize them as innovative kinds of formations that are not merely translating Popper and Hayek and so forth, but actually coming up with new kinds of ideas. And yet at the same time, I'm still going to critique them.
Yeah, I mean, the question of positivism is a tricky one, I think, in the Iranian case, because if we're thinking about, on the one hand, obviously, Popper was also a critique of like positivism and sort of the Vienna school. He had a certain, his critical rationalism is slight. Yeah, I mean, you could look at it as an iteration of such, but I also do think it's got certain nuances maybe which aren't maybe immediately sort of visible, but I think in the Iranian case for me, one of the main concerns was how this sort of, if you want to say positivism or you want to say a certain form of how this sort of, methodological outlook maybe in terms of the socialism or a view of sort of trial and error and whatnot sort of coalesced with a deep pessimism. So it doesn't have sort of the naivete that we're going to get to truth in a sense. In a sense, it's actually sets itself very much antithetical as sort of the antithesis of that. There's a deep kind of ontological skepticism actually. And in a sense, I think what I was trying to do was, very much in a tradition of kind of critical theory or emancipatory critique, sort of saying, by trying to show and delineate how that forecloses possibilities of change and transformation. Because, I mean, I know you want to maybe talk a bit more about Cold War and stuff, but I mean, just briefly, I mean, one of the concerns was sort of trying to understand of like how this uptake of Cold War liberalism and then how it's been adapted and rethought and recalibrated and reprised in the Iranian context is like, it enacts a closure. I mean, it basically, even if it's sort of in a sense in the same voice is calling for change, it's also enacting closure and sort of foreclosing the possibility of transformation, because all sorts of any effort to transformation automatically leads to totalitarianism and violence and all these sorts of things. And that's obviously where the impact of Cold War liberalism comes in. And also, it wasn't just that. I mean, it was also, in a sense, I mean, talking about sort of speaking to the past or recovering things from the past. I mean, in these omissions by sort of Iranian reformism, it kind of just completely didn't learn anything from the 80s, the brutality of the 80s, of which, in a sense, is completely implicated. I mean, so I think that was what was, in a sense, driving the critique there. It was this idea of like, this is actually epistemologically incapable of actually even seeing all of these different challenges and and to power, and actually anathematizes them and anathematizes even the prospects of challenging and changing.
Can you unpack this for us a little bit more? So what is Cold War liberalism? How are you using it in your book? And for the reader who sees a strict separation between past and present, which is antithetical to both of your methods, right? So for the reader who sees a strict separation between past and present, they might balk, they might be surprised, and they might say, well, you're talking about an intellectual formation, a political formation in the 1990s, and the Cold War ended at the beginning of that decade. So why are you using Cold War liberalism as a framework in order to analyze reformist intellectuals when your story starts in 1989 and goes until 2005? I know it's a question that might seem obvious, but I'm hoping you can
No,
unpack.
totally, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, first of all, I don't think it doesn't actually start in '89. I mean, it starts really in like the beginning of the '80s. I mean, like you already see it in the Cultural Revolution. You already see it in the debates between Soroush and Mesbah Yazdi and Farrokh Nigahdar and Ehsan Tabari and these sorts of people, sort of where that was part and parcel of this project of statehood. You had to, in a sense, destroy the tenability, intellectual tenability of the left. And that's why obviously it was, on the one hand, it was being compared to a satanic ideology by people like Soroush, but it was really, what was really being attacked was the sort of the Iranian Marxist pretensions to being a scientific discourse. Mm-hmm. And that's where obviously then you see the connections with Popper, Aron. I mean, the notion of ideology, I mean, despite the fact that in the 60s and 70s, Islamic ideology was, the be all and end all, the alpha and omega. I mean, you see even at this early stage, I mean, like ideology, whose ideology? If it's, if it's Marxist ideology, then clearly it's, it's highly dubious and must be kind of foundationally repudiated. And like I said, the reason why I sort of used that, obviously it undergoes various different changes and permutations throughout the 80s. And obviously, yeah, by 89, it's a cataclysmic sort of event. I mean, and just like one thing, just so, which obviously, they reflected on, I mean, people like Soroush, they went to Prague at this time, like in 91 and stuff. And then if you read like the periodicals of the time, Kehan Farhangi, Kian, then other ones which even came subsequently, I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union is really in their minds. I mean, they have like special issues dedicated to the death of Marxism. So there's a sort of a strange sort of relationship insofar as Islamism is read through the Soviet Union and it's in a sense its failure via analogy, and then this in a sense undergoes a major sort of then they undergo a serious sort of I guess existential crisis of sorts, where I guess liberalism, capitalism, and sort of the dominant sort of prevailing American order is really seen as the only game in town, and there's sort of this call to we need to either reconcile ourselves to this, otherwise we will have the same fate as the Soviet Union. These are questions which they were actually asking of themselves, with something of in terms of like there was a lag in a sense, or there was in a sense overlap as well, but it wasn't. Yeah, they weren't sort of completely synchronous in that sense. But one thing I wanted to say, I mean, one of the reasons that I actually brought in the Cold War liberalism account is because, as I'm sure you know, as you know very well, like one of the problems with sort of intellectual history, or just in the way that often intellectuals in the Islamic world are written about and spoken about, is always through this historicist sort of analogy to the Reformation. So we just have constantly just, one Islamic Luther after another being proclaimed because they happen to say things which, are amenable to mainstream liberal journalists or academic institutions or whatever. And my point was in the sense that you can't actually understand, I mean, superficially, sure. I mean, they might invoke that and there might be certain similarities or whatever. I mean, challenging the clergy, critiquing their monopoly on scripture, all these sorts of things, sure. But you can't actually account for much of the political content of what they're saying if that's all you do. So that's why you have to look at it sort of, in a sense, temporally, like, again, synchronously, look at what was actually happening in the world and who they were reading and what they were engaged in and what sort of world historical events were they themselves thinking about, and how did that actually transform the way in which they viewed their relationship to the Iranian state. I mean, all of these sorts of things are going on in the late 80s, early 90s inside Iran. I don't know if that clarifies like a little bit.
It does. I'm wondering if I can ask about the other side of the Cold War question, which is Marxism. So I'd like to shoot it back to Centime and ask you, well, what's your relationship with Marxism in writing this book? What are you trying to do with Marxism in writing this book? And what do you think what at least in the process of writing this book, did you think the prospects of Marxism for speaking to our contemporary world were?
Sure. So I think what was interesting for me in Ethiopia in the the kind of discourses that were coming out of Ethiopia in the early 1990s, right through until now, is the ways in which Marxism is no longer relevant. But a very odd thing happened in Ethiopia at the end of the Cold War, which is that the only people that were fighting the sort of, the Soviet-backed regime in the 70s and 80s were actually Marxists as well, and came out of the student movement. And so, I mean, the US looked around and they basically were like, who can actually take over the state with the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the collapse of that regime. And what they found was these, this kind of ragtag liberation armies that had been fighting this Soviet-backed regime, and they'd been fighting them in the rural areas, right? And they had very much been shaped by hardcore Marxist discourses, but one where the nationalities question was much more important to them. So when they came to power in the 1990s, they brought a lot of that Marxist baggage with them, oddly enough. And the ways in which the sort of post-Cold War constitution is written is very much shaped by the debates that were happening within the student movement, in the 60s and 70s, particularly around the land question and the nationalities question. So land was not privatized, and the right to self-determination for different ethnicities in Ethiopia continued to be guaranteed, or was guaranteed for the first time, in fact, right? And yet, even as that was happening, there was this other discourse that was like, we're in this post-Cold War period, Marxism isn't really relevant, let's liberalize markets, privatize state enterprises. But in fact, that never really starts to happen until after 2005 in Ethiopia, right? So, I mean, that's interesting that Marxism actually had this kind of life in the country for such a long period. And then for me, I think when I was reading the student movement literature and the kind of ways in which they understood themselves as so scientific, as being able to come up with truth, one type of truth, the ways in which their propositions were never seen as tentative, but sort of were weapons that could literally be used in a battlefield, right? You can law people with your ideas, right? And I kind of track the ways in which certain ideas that come out of the student movement actually become weaponized. And I have an entire chapter called Social Science as a Battlefield. And I'm actually trying to link the ways in which ideas, people, and the war field and policy are all linked together in the Ethiopian context, right? But at the same time, I didn't want to do that kind of Marxism had, left a terrible legacy in Ethiopia, and to hell with all of that, and yay for liberalism or whatever. So part of the tension of my book is to actually recover Marxism as a discourse that can actually critique Marxism or the kinds of Marxism that was at play in Ethiopia. And I think that for me, the Frankfurt School and the thesis on Feuerbach and the kinds of ways in which I think Marx is a critical theorist became really important as a way to sort of think about how to critique the Ethiopian student movement, but also as a way for me to write about the Ethiopian student movement. So that sort of critical tradition within Marxism gives me the tools to both critique Marxism and to retain my Marxism. And in a sense, I make the argument that African studies, I mean, I said at the beginning of our conversation that I'm interested in the relationship between African studies and the practice of the social sciences. And I sort of propose that we need to rethink the ways in which Marx is a critical theorist. And we can do that via the Frankfurt School as a way to then think about how to do critical social sciences. I can talk more about that. That was a lot.
But let's keep talking about it.
Okay.
Would you say that your book is recovering Marxism or doing some of the work that would allow us to recover Marxism in the Iranian context?
I would definitely say that it's like a Marxian critique of the sort of, well, it's a history, but it's also like a critical history in like a sort of Marxian critical theory tradition. That's why sort of I was talking sort of as the sort of ideological critique in a sense. And it's not, on the one hand, you're not interested in obviously presenting a sort of straw man in a sense, simply just to polemicize against. It's not just simply about obviously polemicizing against it. And I think one of the things that was interesting was really, in a sense, getting in. I mean, I sort of a bit like what Centime was sort of saying. It's sort of, I think I was both deeply frustrated and I sort of politically had serious issues with those who I was, in a sense, working on. And in many ways, particularly when I was writing it, it was like an aftermath of 2009 and all these sorts of things. So in Iran, so I think I was deeply frustrated with that as a discourse, reformism, and it was sort of very attuned to its limitations. But I also found sort of the sort of the Marxist critique, or not just the Marxist critique, sort of usually the critique of reformism is simply and I think you and I have spoken about this previously, that it's just this idea that it's simply a safety valve and these people are simply cogs in the system who just end up reproducing this relations of domination, and they really are just insincere and they're all in it together. I mean, that sort of thing that you will often sort of hear. So I mean, just to go back to what Centime was, this sort of sympathetic appreciation of the student movement, like I was also, I mean, I did gain an appreciation for the kind of the intellectual journeys of various different individuals within the Islamic left, as it were, many who were, genuine sort of idealists, revolutionaries, came from very, very humble backgrounds, achieved sort of many ways. I mean, the revolution gave them social mobility. They then went on, to achieve PhDs and write sometimes like quite remarkable sort of things. And you get to really, when you read that literature properly, you get to understand, no, I mean, maybe it's obvious to many other people, but I think for a lot of people, it's not actually that obvious at all, that they're very much deeply invested in this political project. And that project has multiple valences and multiple accents, so I got to like, it does have a more radical Republican face of it. It maybe not be the dominant one, but it does have that. It has one which, even though I would say many are not particularly attuned to, sort of radical agenda of sort of redistribution and wealthy redistribution and things like this, and that had in a sense dropped out. There still were individuals who were very aware that this kind of lacuna, this sort of gap, was very much crippling of the reformist discourse, in the sense that it had been evacuated of any kind of question of political economy. And this is obviously also tied to the elimination of the left. It's because obviously the left wasn't there as this key antagonist, where it previously, since at least, since 1941, at least, where it was the most important mass movement in the country till at least 53. And then obviously after that, then the guerrilla phase and whatnot. But it was like intellectually as well. I mean, people like Matin Asghari and others like, so it did have a sort of intellectual hegemony. And then obviously post 81, that's gradually, I mean, the left is essentially eliminated entirely. And then obviously by 89, it's sort of on the global scale, it's kaput as a project. So, and that obviously had a massive impact for how the reformers came to see themselves. So just like, so in a sense, like I'm saying, I became more attuned and more sympathetic to some of to these stories, and in a sense of just reducing it to some sort of functionalist explanation. I think you can only do that when you actually really go into the archive and you do sort of extensive kind of, you do research, interviews, and you really sort of, in a sense, embed yourself with individuals in sort of within that camp, as it were, but at the same time, very also simultaneously aware that there is a tension between your own politics, your own positionality, and theirs. So it's always trying to manage that in a way which is actually, in a sense, productive rather than actually limiting.
while we're on the topic of talking about your intellectual process, because I think both of you are to some degree talking about, you know, the kind of immanent critiques that you perform. I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the figure of the intellectual. So a reader in the US context, let's say, might pick up these books and say, well, intellectuals are these, you know, marginal elites who aren't really engaged in, you know, the important aspects of transformations in social and political life. And these books, at least in my reading, are certainly presenting the intellectual in a very, very different light. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what you're doing with the figure of the intellectual in your analysis, why you focus on the figure of the intellectual. And I'm wondering if we can potentially draw out some similarities between the status or the position of the figure of the intellectual in these two different contexts. Is there something about, if I can be, you know, kind of reductivist for a moment, is there something about the third world intellectual? Is there something about the status of the intellectual in the third world context that these books bring to light through their mode of writing?
Should I go first?
Please.
Sure, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think that at least my book is trying to capture a moment where the intellectual is really important in Ethiopia. But I mean, I think that's true of the entire 20th century in Ethiopia. There's a sense of a crisis about how do we make sense of ourselves given a changing world system, one where claims to sovereignty have to be made through the nation state. And how do we construct some kind of nation state and get people to sort of buy into it? You know, I think that's the question that is sort of like shaping everything that's going on from the, you know, the Berlin conference until now, actually. How do you bring different language groups together? How do you bring different like economic activities into this nation state, et cetera, right? And I think that, you know, an early iteration of that question is asked by a set of intellectuals in Ethiopia that are associated with a journal called Brahana Nasalam, which means light and peace. And they wrote in like the 20s and the 30s, and they were really struggling with the question of modernity, right? And many of those writers were actually people who had traveled abroad for one reason or another, who had had contact with the Ferengis, with the foreigners, and you know, had come back and were seen as leaders because they had this like special knowledge about this outside world that was reshaping the dynamics of the Horn of Africa internally, right? And I think the student movement is another iteration of people, again, really struggling with this question of how do we make sense of ourselves given a kind of changing world system, right? And so it becomes really obvious in the context of a place like Ethiopia that ideas matter, and that ideas are being struggled over in order to shape like certain political outcomes. But I mean, of course, that's true everywhere, including the US. It would just be a matter of tracing that more specifically, right? And maybe it's not as visible. I think that in a place like Ethiopia, maybe perhaps because of the desperation of coming up with answers, like the role of the intellectual is more obvious or something. But I also think that there's a strange, like in my book, I'm really concerned with the passage of ideas from the university to like political parties to policy to the war field, right? There is this strange kind of movement, and that's why I am concerned with the ways in which ideas actually get, you know, thrown at people, because when you can say I sort of have this truth and I've scientifically come up with an answer, you can launch a civil war against people, you know, based on those answers, and that's slightly terrifying to me. And I do think there's some kind of reality about in relation to that in Ethiopia as well that I was trying to unpack. And me as an intellectual, I mean, gosh, I think I'm trying to conjure a different way of relating to ideas in my book. Like there's some, if I'm being really sort of egotistical, like there's some sort of gift that I'm trying to offer in the book, another way of performing the intellectual that isn't about it isn't so tightly tied to the state or taking over the state, or because all of the intellectuals that I look at in my book in some ways are really implicated in state building projects or civil wars and that kind of thing. And I don't think I'm trying to say that I'm an intellectual that is outside and I'm unconcerned, I have objective distance. I'm definitely an intellectual that's situated and embodied, but I also am trying to think about theory and knowledge production as much more tentative than some of the people that I'm looking at tend to offer. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the figure of the intellectual, obviously, in Iranian history has a complex history. But I think one of my main preoccupations was the fact that the figure of the intellectual in Iran. And yeah, tell me if I'm interested if you actually agree or not. But I mean, particularly in this, it's oppositional. I mean, particularly obviously. Not necessarily so, but the intellectual that is sort of the archetypal one, the one that people laud, the one that's beloved, is sort of oppositional, dissident, very much along almost the Dreyfusard kind of, Zola, J'accuse kind of model, and sort of, this sort of individual sort of conscience, critically minded, willing to sort of talk truth to power, which is almost like something of becomes such a cliche. But and in Iran, I mean, with at least, and obviously, yeah, we have a whole, get Gramsci and the whole typology of different sorts of intellectuals, intellectual activity and engagement. But with sort of these sort of reformist intellectuals, they were always sort of, in a sense, seen as in that light as sort of, I mean, don't get me wrong, there were exceptions insofar as, I mean, people would talk about Syriza's involvement in the Cultural Revolution, but it would sort of, from 85, he was like, that was no longer an issue. It was sort of, there wasn't like a political project in a meaningful sense. And then it usually gave way, particularly in English language literature, again, to this sort of, this really bad historicist sort of narrative with the Protestant sort of, Reformation and the sort of Muslim Luthers and whatnot. So what my main concern was to actually say that no, these intellectuals are actually, they have social and political capital as a result of their involvement in the state building project, the post-revolution state building project. And, they're not extricated from that. They have, personal relationships with ministries, with ministers, with various different elites, and their intellectual, but not just, also the other thing with Iranian intellectuals, sort of get around a lot of the way that these are sort of seen in a very colonial sort of ways of reading, Muslim authors and whatnot. Unless they have sort of medieval theologians with a huge tract, they're not really considered a proper thinker. So I was also just interested in actually, again, this question of intellectual production. So what you notice is like none of them wrote books. None of them wrote monographs, really. Right. They're all articles, right. And they're all in journals, and they're all coming out at particular junctures in response to. So this is why I try to understand Speech Act and all this sort of thing, and then situate like draw like Ellen Wood and others, and put it in sort of broader sort of social historical transformations. So when you actually look at how Iranians wrote, it was all through journals. It was all sort of like they had an addressee. It was like they're addressing someone, they're responding back. I mean, and because they Sarush, or because Shabastari, or because Malakian, or because whoever didn't write, some huge tome, A Being in Time, or Phenomenology of Spirit, or Critique of Pure Reason, or something there, we shouldn't see them as doing something creative or actually transformative or critical. So yeah, I wanted to try and break down the way the intellectualism is generally approached. I mean, it's always approached in either corpus-based studies, like he was born here, he wrote this, he said this, these are his ideas. And I found that, you know, when you actually look at it, you see all these like so-called minor figures in the story who are very crucial, publishers, you know, all these different things, which actually, again, it shows you why certain articles and interventions appeared where they did, what was their sort of implications, how were they sort of trying to actually impact sort of the state, like, you know, and had a claim on it, actually. I mean, this is also the other thing with the sort of this romanticization of the sort of oppositional intellectual in the Iranian case. And this was often the case for reformist figures. No, they had a claim on the state because they were involved in that state building project. So it's not like it's away from them, just they're embedded in those sort of, if you want to get like Palancia, and sort of in that broader sort of network and apparatus somehow. And that's the way what I was sort of was crucial for me to convey, because I thought that was like going to the question of what like something was saying about like intellectual production. I mean, that was just that was absent in almost all the treatments, I think, and most of them anyway, in a really meaningful sense. And I didn't think you could really get like what this reformist sort of apparatus discourse really was unless you got that, because what you would see, like when reform and the reform period was actually unfolding, is that they had each other's back. I mean, you know, they had stakes in each other's projects. When one started, for instance, a newspaper, Mashallah Shams al-Wa'azin, who was one of the key sort of reformist sort of editors and was one of the editors of Kayhana Farhangi, and then subsequently involved to a lesser extent in Kiyan, but then he starts Jam Society newspaper, which is like, you know, really seen as the first major reformist newspaper. And it's like, you know, it's these sort of reformist intellectuals who are saying, yeah, you need to turn this into a platform for us. You know? So, and that's always elided. I mean, so, but I think it's absolutely, you know, it's a crucial, I mean, you can't really understand the story unless you get that side of things. So, I mean, that's broadly what I was trying to kind of convey, which I thought was a bit understated in most of the other ways these things were spoken about.
Centime, you started. Yeah, go ahead.
If I can just add a little bit, I think one thing that just resonated with what Eskandar was saying for me was that there is something called Ethiopian Studies out there. It's a field, and it is primarily concerned with manuscripts from the church in Ethiopia. And there's this whole idea of a certain kind of ancient Ethiopian knowledge that constitutes like an authentic Ethiopian knowledge production. And so when we think about the revolution, what the way it's often talked about is as it's a break from that sort of older type of knowledge production, right? And that, you know, perhaps what was wrong with these students was that they didn't like take that older you know, knowledge production seriously. And in fact, they're not even really serious thinkers because they don't have the, you know, the classical languages that we might associate with Ethiopia, or if they do not, they don't use it in any significant way. And all this Marxism, it's just they're so concerned with like this kind of foreign business. And Ethiopian studies, I would say, is not shaped primarily by Ethiopians, like as an academic field, right? It's something that comes out of SOAS and maybe a few institutions in Germany, and so on. And it's about Amharic and Giz and, you know, all this kind of like linguistic studies. And so I feel like even positing the students as intellectuals in the context of Ethiopian studies is just like, what? How is that even really a thing? And for the most part, political thought is not actually taken seriously when histories of the revolution are actually written. So the revolution is seen as kind of super violent or kind of these crazed people, or sort of like a tendency towards authoritarianism. But in terms of actually thinking about political thought, it's devoid of that. So I think I was also making an intervention into sort of the ways in which Ethiopian studies actually goes about its business as well.
There's a profound question of authenticity in what you just said, because insofar as the people who you said were forming the field of Ethiopian studies were based outside of the country, it sounds a lot like Orientalism.
Right.
And then you have these people who are outside of Ethiopia, engaging in these debates in journals, not in tomes, not in monographs. And they could be seen as being inauthentic insofar as they are based outside of the country and therefore don't have access to what's really going on inside of the country. And to a certain degree, you also kind of talk about your own positionality as moving between contexts, as engaging in primarily an English language journal with Challenge, as opposed to an Amharic-based journal. And so I'm wondering if we can slightly pivot from talking about the intellectual to get back to an earlier point and talking about your own kind of method and intellectual process around these questions of authenticity, which I think gets us back to the general overarching question of what is truth and what is knowledge production in social science.
So the question is, what was my method?
Well, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about, how you navigated the question of authenticity and epistemic authority. What you just said about Ethiopian studies is quite a sharp critique.
So I think I wrote my book. I used to be an angry person. I'm not so angry anymore. But I was really frustrated with Ethiopian studies as a younger sort of scholar. I was really frustrated with the obsession with a kind of church literature as the only kind of way to think about Ethiopia. And the idea that Ethiopia had this continuity over 3,000 years, I mean, this just can't be the case, right? And so at a personal level, was never interested in regaining that authenticity. I didn't want to be 3,000 years old. I really wanted to rub against that kind of history. And I really wanted to think about how a changing political economy in the late 19th century in Africa was changing the nature of the nation state, of territoriality, of ideas around borders. And you can go into the archive and really find the ways in which different princes, Ethiopian princesses and leaders are actually starting to rethink the question of borders or the nation and so on, right? And that seemed to be reconstituting internal social relations in Ethiopia in a really important way that was being ignored through this literature around Abyssinia and Amharic and this church literature and so on, right? So I always felt that Ethiopian studies was very sort of apolitical and quite irrelevant to the questions that were important to 20th century history in Ethiopia. And so I suppose I myself was a bit irreverent to that field. And part of the book is about me also asking, well, what could it mean to do Ethiopian studies given that history, right? I'm very irreverent in that sense. And I really try to show how the question of authenticity is a problem, and it's a block. It's a block that means that we don't get at the important sort of questions that face people in their everyday lives in Ethiopia. So, I guess at a personal level, I was of the conviction that my questions ultimately were more interesting than those who were doing Ethiopian studies in the more traditional sense of how one would do it.
Can I shoot this question to Eskandar as well? Because I think it's a point of contention, if to say the least, in Iranian studies, where people will say, okay, you're based in the UK. When's the last time you were in Iran? On what grounds can you speak about what's going on in Iran? There's always this use of a notion of authenticity as a kind of measurement of epistemic authority. Especially, I haven't
spoken to any Iranian taxi drivers in a while, so you can't write a.
You gotta have the taxi drivers.
The Times op-eds in the pipeline, unfortunately.
Right. I mean, especially when you're talking about domestic politics, the way that you are in such depth in this book. And so I'm wondering, how did you navigate that in the process of writing the book, and how do you navigate that now when you talk?
If I'm being honest, it was never. I mean, personally, just never an issue really for me that, am I really, I mean, on the basis of, have I gone to Iran recently and whatnot? I mean, as you know, there's lots of issues about, if you write things which are relatively critical or things which are deemed such, or regardless, you have certain associations or whatnot. I mean, it's that negotiating that and then going back and how these sorts of things is often a much more intricate thing than many people are willing to kind of entertain. But I mean, because I was largely, I mean, I thought I had a better hold on the, again, not to fetishize the archive, but I thought I had a good hold on the sources which were like absolutely indispensable for me to be able to trace and reconstruct and rethink things. Especially because, I mean, there is this, I mean, not to fetishize the archive again, but there's also a problem in sort of subsequent recollections and a sort of rewriting of history. And this is obviously a big issue inside the country. So I did put, I can say that without being sort of excessively positivist, but I did put like an emphasis on actually trying to get contemporaneous documents. So I mean, I actually found like massive discrepancies in books that were printed later by some of these intellectuals, like significant omissions to, like, in a sense, rewrite the historical record. And I thought, because I was relatively like comfortable in that and I was rooted in that, I thought I had a good hold on that. The question of authenticity in that sense didn't really have, I mean, it wasn't a driver. It wasn't sort of my main issue. Because I mean, yeah, I guess the fact that it wasn't also an issue is because, I don't know. I mean, the sort of the Orientalist sort of approach and the fact that you're rooted in, I mean, that was never. I mean, I guess we do have that in the field, and obviously there is that history, but yeah, I never felt it compelling. It was never really a driver or a question for me. So that's one thing. I mean, obviously the question of authenticity just regarding Iran and how that's debated and thought about is a whole topic unto itself. And again, I'm just not interested in those fights. I mean, some people want to say, the left, sort of the Ijtimaiyun Amiyun, sort of the social democrats of the constitution are the real Iranians, and some want to say no, it was Akhund Khorasani and the senior clergy who intervened, or the sort of that represents the authentic tradition. I mean, yeah, that was never really interesting or pertinent for me. And obviously, these fights continue to carry on in many respects. And to be honest, I'm actually really I'm just more interested in actually just critiquing this whole notion of authenticity, how that's actually, I mean, even how sort of intellectual history in the 60s and 70s is read, I think, through this lens, is just, I think it misses so much and gets so much wrong as well. So yeah, it just, I mean, I could have been, when writing the book, more upfront in a sense, less sort of trying to efface my role as author in writing the book. Perhaps that could have been more on the chin. Like, I mean, someone recently like shared the preface of Ervan Abrahamyan's book in the Iranian Mujahideen, where he's like, yeah, I'm an Armenian, I'm on the left, and most of the days I'm agnostic, if not an atheist. So he like stated really, really, I never felt any compulsion to do that. I guess because I just felt the stakes for me, as far as I was concerned, lied elsewhere. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, though, but it's an attempt. Yeah.
It gets me to the next question, which is perhaps a difficult one to ask, but why did you write these books, and what do they mean to you now? I mean, to give you a sense of where I'm coming from in asking the question, these are books about, and this will be my last question, these are books about these dramatic, sudden and intense transformations. And here we are, potentially in the midst of another dramatic, sudden and intense transformation, not a revolution necessarily, but a pandemic. Yes. And so why did you write the book, and how do you make sense of it now?
Or should I go, or do you want to go? Or?
I can start. We can volley back and forth, perhaps. Why did I write the book? I suppose that one of the things that was I will say that the personal is important for me in the book, and the book is a defense of embodied knowledge. And it makes the argument that there is no other kind of knowledge but embodied knowledge, and that Marxism helps us to think about embodied knowledge as potentially universal knowledge, right? Because the ways in which my body becomes part of its relations to others is never just a story about myself, right? It is a story about me in the world. And so to start from my body and to start from my situation is actually to pull the universal out of me rather than to look for the universal outside somewhere else, right? So in that sense, the book is personal, but it's also trying to make an argument about why the personal matters. And it also, I think, there's kind of a feminist positionality there as well, right? So, and then, you know, I think for me as a sort of child of the revolution, I think one of the ways in which the story of the revolution is told today is that, you know, the 80s and the 70s in Ethiopia was a time of, you know, a lot of violence and a lot of authoritarianism. And that tends to be blamed on the sort of the revolutionary government that took over after 1975, known as the Derg. But in fact, when I was growing up, there were all kinds of people that like passed through either the family home or in my relative's home that came from the entire political spectrum of the sort of Ethiopian milieu. And it seemed to me that they had all participated in some way or the other. They were all implicated in creating this moment in the 70s and 80s of a lot of violence. And and yet they could still talk to each other. They could still have conversations. Some of them had been in prison. Some of them perhaps were imprisoned by their friend. I don't know. Some, you know, a lot of people have died, so on and so forth. I was very confused by this as a child. And I was like, well, what were you really up to? What was this violence all about? Why would people participate in creating all of this violence and yet somehow still be able to have conversations and still be friends with each other too? And I actually, at some levels, the book is a working through for me of that very like experiential moment as a child of just like, what were you guys really up to? But again, I have a line in the book, or, you know, the last chapter of the book is called Theory as Memoir. And the idea is that I'm taking this very personal experience and actually using theory to think about this moment as sort of having all of this like lessons. I generate political theory out of it, actually. And yeah, so that's sort of, I think, why I wrote the book. I mean, in some ways I felt a lot better after I wrote the book. I was just like, I know how to live with this violence and I know how to live with these people in new ways. So on some levels, the book was satisfying on that level. But I talked earlier about like a different way of being an intellectual. And I suppose part of what I'm trying to propose is like when we start from situated and embodied knowledge and build sort of theory from there, or something different happens. So I wrote the book for that reason as well.
Why did you write your book, Eskandar?
I mean, apart from just like the mundane reasons, which I think we all go through this process and subject ourselves to it. I mean, I think one of the reasons that I wrote it was, it sort of goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about at that point, particularly, especially if we want to sort of just situate it. I mean, I was in Iran during this 2009, the whole Green movement and the unfolding of that, and then obviously the fallout of that following its repression. And then there was a lot of, hope and pessimism and sort of bleakness in the particular milieu which I inhabited. But at the same time, I found it also inadequate and, like I said, sort of foreclosed certain ways of thinking certain forms of perhaps, rethinking the revolution and its legacy in certain respects, which I thought was it was necessary in a sense to show how potentially reform works and operates, a sort of modus operandi, how it sort of obscures this, so that we can obviously, rethink certain things anew. And I would say, I think maybe that's what I'm trying to do with sort of subsequent projects. But I think it was, in a sense, it was so hegemonic. And then also, it wasn't just that. It's like, one, you had to 2009, but then you also had the 2008, 2009 financial crisis here in Europe and the United States. I mean, globally. And I mean, it was just so stark, the sort of the impact of sort of this Cold War liberalism and these sort of, in a sense, the pathologization of any form of systemic challenge, systemic critique. So it just seemed like such a gap, it was so stark that this was missing. And I think, like I said, I thought it was necessary to sort of do this book, show this sort of, in a sense, the genealogy of this, sort of at least intellectual current and political current, and obviously its real practical effects, which can be often demobilizing, inhibiting, and restricting. So again, I thought it was through critique you could potentially open up potentially certain possibilities, because obviously I think globally, obviously we are in a huge crisis and period of transition, and Iran in its own way, I mean, the nature of its crisis does have a certain specificity as well as a universality, and is obviously interfacing with what's happening elsewhere. And I thought it was crucial to kind of understand that story in order to move past it, in a sense.
So this is the first time you two have met each other, and we've spoken for about an hour and a half about your respective book projects and writing processes. I'm wondering if you have anything to say to each other in closing or in conclusion, and if not, we can just end it.
No, I mean, obviously this is going to sound rather trite, but I am really genuinely interested I really have to be honest, I have to applaud you because, Arash, because you are sort of the grand synthesizer here, and you're bringing together all these various threads, and have really highlighted this. And I mean, this might be a really stupid question on my part, but obviously there's another person who brought Ethiopia and Iran together, who then later became, in my view, a little bit problematic, but obviously Fred Halliday. And I was just kind of, so I was obviously thinking that was someone else who clearly, he had Yemen, he had lots of other different hats, but he clearly did write about Ethiopia and Ethiopian revolution. So I was actually interested to actually ask you. I just didn't want to sound ask a question about Ethiopia, but I was genuinely curious what you made, because I'm obviously familiar with his famous book on Iran, which basically came out just before the revolution, but then didn't see the Islamist opposition at all. So I was curious if there were any sort of blind spots, myopia in his treatment of Ethiopia as well.
I spent a lot of time talking about Halliday's blind spots in my book, actually.
Okay, that's really good. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. By the end of the Cold War, Halliday sort of becomes an apologist for American empire as well.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So, and I think you can start to see that in his earlier writings, in the way that he understands. He's very much against the student movement in Ethiopia. He thinks they're just full of hot air. He's definitely a typical example of somebody who doesn't think that they're producing political thought as such. He's very much in support of the military government as a kind of rational instrument that can bring order to the situation. So it makes sense to me that he becomes an apologist for empire.
Can I ask, what were his main writings on, when is sort of his seminal contribution on Ethiopia?
I mean, he has a huge book that he wrote with his wife, Molyneux, Maxine, I think is her name. It was probably the most important book on the Ethiopian Revolution in the 80s. And I can't remember the title of it right now.
It would be interesting to see whether his kind of, in a sense, left melancholia or complete disillusion in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, which obviously happened with a lot of people on the left. They essentially just saw the left get everything wrong, and then basically face annihilation. And then it seemed like you see this drift towards, yeah, like you said, basically military humanism, liberal intervention, sort of the liberal international order as the sole guarantor of stability and good order in the world. So it would be interesting. It'd be interesting to see how Iran and impact reflected his maybe reading in Ethiopia.
I would think that actually he was in Ethiopia before Iran. So because the Ethiopian revolution's in 1974. So we could ask the question of how his experience in Ethiopia might have shaped his interpretation of Iran, actually, which I'm sure it did.
Yeah. Well, yeah, not seeing it like political Islam or the Islamist sort of as a force, social force was clearly quite significant.
Right, and he doesn't see the student movement, or even the fact that the student movements go to the rural areas to launch their civil wars. Like none of that is like apparent or in his book at all. It just becomes the military regime and this top-down sort of, it becomes a defense of revolution from above. I think he actually uses that term.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's definitely like a couple of articles in there, I'm sure. Like
right. Yeah.
Because it is interesting how he moves between those different sites, and then basically, like you were sort of saying, becomes, I guess, particularly with Yugoslavia and things like that, then really out and out defender of, like you said, for American empire. So. No, it's a curious sort of series of connections there.
Wasn't Halliday, was he editor at the New Left Review?
He was, yeah. And then I think he then pretty much, I mean, I can't remember specifically the details, but obviously after the revolution, then he clearly, I mean, he had a massive falling out with Tariq Ali and others, who denounced them as basically being apologists for, authoritarianism. And I guess that also just brings you to certain coordinates of the sort of left impasse and sterility of a lot of intra-left debates about, okay, you're being apologists for authoritarians who happen to be fighting imperialists, or versus those who are seen as actually true stewards of the masses. And I mean, that logjam is constantly kind of rehashing and reappearing in various sites.
I won't say anything more than that, though. I think we're good.
Okay.
We can carry on the conversation in person and in conferences later.
Yeah, sounds good.
For today, I think we're good.
Covered a lot of ground.
Yeah,
Thank
we did.
You both for these incredible books and for this conversation today.
Yeah, it was really fun. Thank you, Arash.
Great. Thanks so much, Arash. Thank you also. Thank you so much.